Hey everyone, so we're going to start to make a transition in a couple of weeks. You're going to do in person, in groups, case study competitions. So instead of written case studies, you're going to be doing sort of in the moment responding. I'm going to go a little easy on you. You'll actually have warnings so that you can prepare before the class. But basically, you'll get a moderator's question, you'll give a presentation, then the other team is going to give a commentary. Then you're going to give a response to commentary, and then we're going to have judges question and answers. So that'll all be out loud instead of written. What you're going to notice in the assignments this week is that you're not doing that yet, but you are doing a reply to my commentary on your case study twos. Now, I've done my commentary by video, and you have an option to reply to my commentary by video or in writing. It's sort of up to you for this. But what I wanted to do is to just sort of give you a little demo of what this would look like out loud in terms of initial presentation. And when we do the initial presentations, those are going to be capped at 10 minutes. Now, these Screencast-O-Matics, I have 15 minutes to do it. So what I'm going to do here is just start by going through the case itself so you know what the case is about. And then I'm going to go ahead and do the a presentation as if I was you guys. Okay, so this is from 2017, and it's Rivers Are People Too. And so I'm not going to read every word, but basically in 2017, New Zealand passed a law which gave personhood, legal personhood status to a river. And India also did that with the Ganges and the Yamuna. And of course, when you are granted personhood status, you have a lot of legal rights and responsibilities. So you have a quote here from the Maori or Maori spokesperson, Gerard Albert. We fought to find an approximation in law so that all others can understand that from our perspective, treating the rivers as a living entity is the correct way to approach it as an indivisible whole, instead of thinking it as something that others own and you're just managing it. In addition to this view of personhood, there's practical advantages, and the big idea of the practical advantages here is that it shifts the focus away from basing protection on rivers about harm to people and begins to give the rivers themselves rights. So that's sort of a big deal because it makes it much easier to protect the rivers, right? Because think about the difference between saying, well, we need to pollute in order to have this kind of industry, that kind of thing. But of course, there's drawbacks. So the case goes on. These new protections have some people worried about the possible effects of protecting rivers on the local human populations. City sewage, farming pesticides, and industrial waste are currently dumped into the Yamuna, and these waste products are, to some extent, unavoidable aspect of urban development. So if you stopped it entirely, you would negatively impact the businesses, etc. And then there's this other suggestion here about just like, is it just sort of crazy to call a river a person? Now we do this with businesses. Corporations are in some ways legal persons. There are, of course, fights over whether fetuses are persons. There are fights about whether some animals should be considered persons. But this is sort of a new step in that. Okay, so now you've sort of got a sense of what the case itself is. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just give my presentation, and I'm going to keep myself within 10 minutes. Okay, first, before I give a presentation, I'm going to sort of give the moderator's question to myself. So here's the moderator's question. When, if ever, is it morally appropriate to give a non-human being the legal status of personhood? I'm going to repeat that. When, if ever, is it morally appropriate to give a non-human being the legal status of personhood? Okay, now I'm going to go. Okay, thank you for the moderator's question. The case I'm dealing with is case 15, Rivers Are People Too. Basically, in this case, you have several examples of rivers that were given the status of legal personhood in order to protect them so that they weren't always having interests traded off for economic interests, etc. And this is a way of protecting the rivers much more strictly. The moderator's question about the case is, when, if ever, is it morally appropriate to give a non-human being the legal status of personhood? And I'm going to give what's going to sound at first like a pretty vague answer, which is that I'm going to argue that it is appropriate, morally appropriate, to give a non-human being the legal status of personhood whenever we have sufficient moral reason to give it that status. Now that sounds super vague and almost circular, but I want to explain what I mean. The reason I'm giving that vague definition is that what I'm going to suggest is our reason for giving something legal personhood status is not about a metaphysical claim about whether the thing is enough like a person. So let me explain what I mean by that. We might say that certain features allow a being to be considered a person. So we might say the ability to use reason is what allows you to have personhood. And certainly this is in keeping with someone like Immanuel Kant would say it's our duty not just to use reason, but to use it in a particular way of being able to recognize and give ourselves the moral law that allows us to have the moral status of being free and autonomous agents, and that's sort of a foundational basis for personhood. But in general, we tend to think that, right, human beings are different from even other animals because we have a capacity they lack, the capacity to reason. And typically this is reflected in law, that we're allowed to use non-human animals for experimentation and put them in zoos and even eat them, which means, of course, that we think, perhaps wrongly, that these beings don't have the same moral status as human beings because they lack an important capacity, and therefore there's this big divide between us, legal persons, and them, non-legal persons. I want to reject that, and I want to say instead that the criteria for considering something a person should be bound up with thinking about what gives something moral worth at all, but also is bound up with why we might have ethical reasons for thinking of something as a person. And those are two separate questions. So first, let's think a little bit about what it means to various ways to think about why something would have moral worth. So of course you have this idea that if you are rational, you have dignity and therefore deserve moral worth, sort of Kantian approach. You have the much more accessible approach of utilitarianism, that all beings that can suffer deserve moral consideration, something that seems common sense. And then you have theories that are a little bigger, like Paul Taylor's biocentrism or Aldo Leopold's ecocentrism, which extend this circle further. Taylor's biocentrism is going to argue that not only animals that can suffer, but other living beings deserve moral respect because they are teleological centers of concern. And all that means is, just as a human being has various interests, right? A pig has interest in not being eaten, not suffering pain, etc. But not just animals, other beings too. Consider a tree can be thought of as having a thing it is supposed to be, right? So a tree sort of wants is not, of course, right, because we don't think of trees as actually having desires, but if all goes well and right with the tree, it will flourish and grow, and even ecosystems can be thought of that way. So when we thwart that, we do something wrong. Now, rivers are actually pretty complicated to think of that way because it's actually a little harder to envision what the interest of a river is as opposed to thinking of the interest of a tree. So I'm going to suggest that even thinking that way is going to be problematic. And Aldo Leopold's ecocentrism isn't going to help us all that much more because the land ethic by Leopold really focuses on the idea that ecosystems and species as a whole have value. But that would help us if we think about the river as an ecosystem. But it doesn't necessarily help us if we just think of the river as its own entity. So what I'm going to suggest is that our basis for conferring personhood status on the river in some ways actually has nothing to do with whether the river itself has any philosophical understanding of why it is that the river itself has status as an area, a locus of moral concern. Instead, what I'm going to suggest is that we confer personhood on entities when we think there's a really important moral reason for doing so. And there's two types of these moral reasons. The first is that we want to make sure that the entity has certain responsibilities. So corporations are considered legal persons in some contexts so that people can sue them and hold them accountable for wrongdoing. And so there's an important moral reason to have corporations be considered legal persons in some contexts. Now, of course, they've also lately been given rights, like the right to free speech, and that's pretty controversial. I'm not going to get into that. But we can think of that basic idea as it's important to give responsibilities and flip that over and to say we might want to do the same thing and give the river rights. And I'm going to suggest that in the cases of the Ganges, the Yamuna, and the Wanguni, pardon my pronunciation, that there is sufficient moral reason for giving them legal personhood status because these rivers need protection because of the extensive damage that will be done to them without this protection. The reason for that is there's a long tradition of using these rivers without much regard for their future well-being. And so we see industry making heavy use of them. The Ganges, for example, is a heavily polluted river. And so whenever we're in this utilitarian framework where we're going to say, well, of course, it's in human beings' best interest for the river to be protected, but it's also in other human beings' interest for the river to be not as protected because we're juggling the needs of, let's say, industry and those who want clean drinking water, etc. That's always going to result in a wrestling match. But conferring rights on the river is going to mean one side gets priority. So I would like to argue that it is morally right that the river gets high priority here because it is the only way to protect this important resource. And I'm going to try to set aside the arguments about whether it's because I owe that to the river, I owe that to the people affected by the river, or future generations who would be affected by the river, and instead just argue that it is a combination of all of these things that leads to the common sense notion that we ought to be concerned about the river. So my claim here is that we should confer personhood status, not because a thing is like a human being, but when we have a good ethical reason to do so, and that in the case of these rivers, we have such a good ethical reason. Now, I recognize that there are counter-arguments in the case about the fact that this would damage the interest of several human beings, such as those wishing to pollute or even needing to pollute and the industries that depend on that. But my claim here is that those impacts are outweighed by the massive damage that is and would continue to be done to those rivers if we did not take this additional step of protecting them. So, in summary, I am arguing that these rivers ought to be protected. I'm arguing that they ought to be protected very strongly, which is, and the reason that let me explain that. We give something personhood status as a way of giving it rights. And if the only way to legally maximally protect a thing is to give it rights, then we ought to do that. Would I prefer that we would call it a sacred space as opposed to a person? Sure, it would be less complicated. But this is a legal avenue open to us, so I'm suggesting it's the one we ought to take. Okay, so that was almost exactly 10 minutes, and it's just an example. There's lots of flaws in it, but that's the reason why we have a commentary, response to commentary, and Q&A. All right, we're going to talk more about this in class. Look forward to it.